Today's lecture, we're going to be covering the 15th century in Italy, focusing on the development and widespread nature of the Renaissance art. So we're going to be talking about the Renaissance style, and we're going to be discussing our first Renaissance period. The 15th century in Italy is called by scholars the Quattrocento. Hopefully you guys know how centuries work, but the 15th century primarily is the 1400s. So that's why most scholars call this period the Quattrocento. Quattro in Italian means four, right? So the 400s, so 1400s. Let's move to our map. Okay, looking at our map, this is similar to the map that we looked at during our last chapter where we talked about Italy. Chapter 19, we were talking about the north, and now we're back down to Italy. Chapter 18, we talked about Italy then too. You can see that Italy is still not one single entity. That's not going to happen for quite some time now. They are still in these separate, I guess you could call them sort of states, but they're each kind of their own kingdom or republics, or some of them have dukes. Yeah, so this is the map that we're mostly looking at. We're going to be focusing again on the Republic of Florence right here. Kind of confusing because we're going to be talking about the Republic of Florence and the city of Florence. So it's going to be kind of hard to figure out if I'm talking about the area or the city. Heads up, I'm usually talking about the city. But there are other cities in Florence. For example, we discussed Pisa last time. Siena used to be part of Florence, and well, now this sort of territory here is kind of in flux. We're also going to be discussing towards the end of this chapter the Papal States down here. Including the Papal States is the city of Rome, so that's going to be hugely important, because that's where the Pope lives. And we're also going to talk about the Republic of Venice. Again, similar to Florence, there's the Republic of Venice and the City of Venice. Usually, though, I'm talking about the city. We don't really get to Milan today, but we will in the next chapter. So just to sort of set up the historical context for this chapter, we saw in our last chapter we talked about Italy, how plays and poems like Dante's Inferno had led to the widespread, the spreading of a common vernacular language, this language of Italian that is now taking over, and most of the important books are being now published in Italian instead of in Latin, which is nice because almost everyone now is speaking in, well, not necessarily reading, but speaking at least Italian. And they can now have access to literature. They don't have to learn Latin in order to do so. The philosophy that's coming up and burgeoning during this time is humanist-centered, so it's beginning finally to spill over into artistic techniques. We saw there was a bit of a delay, but the church is going to start to get on board, and as well as these sort of secular families that are rising up are going to definitely be on board with humanist-centered art. People are going to begin putting an emphasis on education and exploring the potential of the individual. There's this idea that a smart person, a genius person, can come from anywhere, that they don't have to necessarily just be born into it. So they're going to place an emphasis on educating their people. They're going to be deeply proud of their past, and they're going to want to encourage people to explore and to learn about their past. Specifically, because we're talking about Italy, they're going to be mostly enamored with the ancient Romans. That's really their proudest moment in their past, but at the same time they're not going to get lost or caught up in the past. It seems like they were definitely aware that they were living during a time period that was very important, because they're sort of deeply ingrained in their own idea of civic responsibility and doing their duty to their city and making a lasting impression in the here and now. So they're not just living in the past, but they're going to sort of be moving forward as well. Along the same lines of education, in 1445 we see the invention of printed movable type by Johann Gutenberg. It actually comes from the north but makes its way down to Italy very quickly. With the printed movable type, people do not need to sit there and hand copy manuscripts. So books now are in Italian, so more people can read them. People are more they're being produced by guilds, and so not by monks anymore. So they're copying books that are more sort of interesting to people who are secular humanists, and people can now finally afford books. So before, manuscripts used to be very expensive, and now they're not going to be cheap, but they're going to be able to move a lot more units, and people from the sort of middle class, even the sort of the lower middle class, will be able to afford it. And they're going to be translating all of these ancient texts into, from Latin, some of them from Latin into Italian. They're also going to be really interested in books on science and education and engineering and medicine, and that's kind of where we get the term Renaissance man. A Renaissance man is someone who is well versed and skilled in many different fields. So science and education and engineering and philosophy and mathematics, as well as art, and not just one field of art, but sculpting and painting and frescoes and all that stuff. Renaissance, I should say, we start referring to Italy in the 15th century as Renaissance Italy. Renaissance is actually a French term, oddly enough, because it's talking about Italy mostly, but the Renaissance means rebirth. Right, we covered this before. So it's a rebirth of interest in all of these, all of the ancient philosophies and religion, and mostly in the ancient philosophy of humanism. It's during this time period that people are going to stop according such great power to the divine as the main determinant for all of the events in their lives. It was during the medieval period where, we kind of discussed this briefly, but if you got sick, it was because God wanted you to be sick. If people died, it's because God wanted them to die. And they didn't really have any impetus to question the world around them. Well, during the Renaissance, they kind of stop with that, with sort of blaming everything on God or attributing everything to God and God's whim. Remember, they're taking back the idea of the individual, and humanism is the power of human beings to make their own fate. And so they're going to, they're still going to be religious, obviously, but they're going to be more interested in making their own destiny. And going hand in hand with that, we have the idea of the self-made man, that you could come from nothing, literally, and move yourself up because of education, because you are a smart person. The classical nude, because of humanism, is going to come back in a big way, so we'll talk about this actually a little bit later in the slideshow, but humanism, we talked about Polykleitos being really interested in and setting the standard for the ideal human body. Humanism is going to be interested in humans, and there's sort of idea that the human body is very close to the divine. So artists need to be really good at depicting the human body, and according to the rules of the Renaissance, it has to be naturalistic and realistic. And so they start to yearn for showing nude figures more often and in more greater context, so that they could show off their humanism talent and their talent for displaying the nude. So that's what you're looking at here. The best place to start our discussion is in 1401 in Florence. So we're in the city of Florence in the Republic of Florence, and we're going to be talking about the baptistry of the Florence Cathedral. This is the Florence Cathedral. We're going to talk about, ignore this top part right here. We're going to talk about that a little bit later in our lecture. But right now we're discussing the baptistry. So this is the cathedral, this long basilica. This is the bell tower up here. And then facing, if you imagine walking out the doors of this cathedral, you would be faced with this building, and this is the baptistry. A baptistry is a building where they hold baptisms, which is a Christian rite of passage involving a sort of a cleansing ritual. It happens now mostly in Christian sects for a little, most Christian sects do it for babies, but back in the day it used to be more like teenagers, adults would get baptized. And they had their own building dedicated specifically to it. And it was a building that you would only see the inside of really once in your life. So that's kind of interesting. In 1401, the the city of Florence held a competition to see who would decorate the doors of the baptistry. So these were the doors. And they had this competition. It was a very illustrious commission that a lot of artists wanted to have because these are the doors that, again, you face as soon as you walk out of the cathedral. So, really important city, the Republic of Florence, has already shown that it's going to be the leader in this march towards the Renaissance, and these are really important doors. The commission was for gilded bronze door panels. So you can see here, these are bronze that are hammered to look like a relief, and then would have been covered in gold. For the competition, each artist who wanted to be entered had to submit a panel depicting a scene of the sacrifice of Isaac. So, sacrifice of Isaac is sort of a really it's an Old Testament story if you're familiar with the Old Testament Bible, in which God comes down to Abraham, and he tells Abraham to go up to the mountain and to sacrifice his only son Isaac to God. And Abraham, being a good little Jew at the time, decides, okay, fine, I'm going to do this because that's what God wants. It might seem weird, but he did, because you don't really question God. So he takes him up to the mountain to be sacrificed. We'll get to what actually happens in just a second, but you might be asking, okay, why is this Old Testament story supposed to be so prominently featured in a Christian baptistry doors? Well, the Christians saw a connection between Abraham's sacrifice of his son Isaac and God's sacrifice of his son Jesus, of Nazareth, Jesus Christ. So they like this story because they kind of considered it a prefiguration of the sacrifice that's going to happen in the New Testament. So they had hundreds of applicants for this. Of the hundreds of applicants, they selected seven semifinalists, and of those seven semifinalists, only 2 finalists survive the 2 panels that I'm about to show you. So here we have our starred slide. We have our 2 panels. This one here on your left, right? Okay, good. It's on your left, is by Filippo Brunelleschi, and the one on your right is by Lorenzo Ghiberti. So we're going to be talking about Brunelleschi and Ghiberti. Yes, his name is pronounced Brunelleschi. This SCH, the CH before an I in Italian makes a K sound, so it's bruschetta. Just fun fact, it's pronounced bruschetta, not bruschetta. Okay. Both of the scenes, again, are portraying the sacrifice of Isaac. So in Brunelleschi's, here's Abraham. He's about to, sacrifice or slit the throat of his son. This is his son Isaac. Over here, you can see this large figure, again, Abraham, and again, leering very menacingly towards his son Isaac. It's interesting that they're kind of going in different directions. The design here it's called a quatrefoil, means it has 4 of these little petals. That's what you're looking at. It's called quatrefoil. In the story, God waits until the very last second, and you can see definitely in Filippo Brunelleschi's, it's the very, very last second. Then he sends an angel out of the sky to sort of stay to stay Abraham's hand, to stop him from slitting his son's throat at the very last second. He says, "Oh no, sorry, just kidding. I just wanted to see if you would do it. I'm glad that you were going to do it. I'm glad that you're such a loyal follower, but don't kill your son, because that's weird. Instead, sacrifice this. Sometimes it's a lamb, sometimes it's a ram. So it's a ram in this case. Instead, sacrifice this ram." And so here's the ram that they're going to kill instead. Here's the angel stopping him at the last second. Here's Ghiberti's angel, and here's Ghiberti's lamb. The jury was sort of gridlocked on deciding which of these 2 should win. But in the end, they decided that one of them better encompassed the spirit of this Renaissance progression. If you'll recall, some of the qualities of the pre-Renaissance that we studied in the artist Giotto, hopefully you remember Giotto from 2 chapters ago, some of the qualities that Giotto had were creating a believable scene in a believable background right? Where the background looked naturalistic, where we looked, it looked as if we were peering through a window into space. Some things that Giotto also showed was more interest in people being involved in the scene and not really looking out at us, right? So we actually do see that in both. And then on sort of naturalistic movement and placement of people and well, we already saw that the new Renaissance is definitely going to be interested in body and proportions and the nude. So, as I said, it did come very, very closely. You can see that in Filippo Brunelleschi's, everything is very clear and orderly, and you can see everything's kind of organized into neat registers, which the Romans definitely would have liked. Whereas Lorenzo Ghiberti, everything looks a little bit more swirly. But if you look closely at Lorenzo Ghiberti's background, this rocky landscape looks very much believable. Whereas this one, it kind of looks like the sheep is floating, the background back here is just sort of ambiguous, and yeah, so and if you look, I think that the real deciding factor between the two was their Isaacs. So if you look at Brunelleschi's Isaac, he's sort of scrawny and sad and I don't know, just not very impressive. Whereas Ghiberti's Isaac, this is a classical nude. He's muscular, he's athletic, he's facing his fate bravely and stoically. The Romans and the Greeks would have loved this classical nude, and apparently the jurors did as well, because they did eventually pick Lorenzo Ghiberti's. And if you listen to Filippo Brunelleschi's biography. He had a biography written of him during his lifetime because he is a really important artist and he's going to go on to do many great things despite the fact that he loses. Filippo Brunelleschi claims that it was a tie and that he backed out of the competition out of a sort of spirit of sportsmanship. But then he issued a decree that he was never going to sculpt again because he was disappointed. He also said that Lorenzo Ghiberti only won because Ghiberti came up with a way of hammering bronze so that it was thinner than poured bronze. So they went with his idea because it would be cheaper. If you obviously listen to Ghiberti's, he says that he won fair and square, that certain elements of his design were more appealing to the jurors and they chose him. So it kind of depends on, it's a he said kind of thing. So it's kind of hard to tell. Oh, I do want to point out that even though this Isaac is in a very impressive classical nude stance, he's not quite 100% there yet. If you see his Abraham's almost in a awkward sort of S curve. His Abraham's not very Renaissance yet, but Ghiberti is going to have a couple years during the creation of these baptistry doors, because obviously it's going to take him a long time to make them. He's going to have a couple years to refine his talent. And Brunelleschi never sculpts again. Instead, he devotes himself to architecture. So, as I said, he'll go on to do great things, but this was not his moment. During the years that Lorenzo Ghiberti is working on his baptistry doors, a young upstart named Donatello is working on the same sort of commission for the baptistry of Siena. So, Ghiberti is working on Florence, and Donatello is working in Siena. He comes up with our first example that we're going to see of an attempt at using linear perspective. Linear perspective is defined in your book, so if you want a really good definition of it, you should check there. But linear perspective is the idea that, well, again, perspective is the idea that things get smaller as they retreat into space. Linear perspective is the idea that if you look at two parallel lines going off into the horizon, they will eventually appear to meet because lines get closer together as they retreat into space. So, for example, if you were staring at train tracks off in the distance, even though we know that those train tracks will never touch, because that would be a terrible design for train tracks, if you stare at them into the horizon, the tracks will appear to meet at a certain point on the horizon. So linear perspective uses lines called orthogonals to retreat into space and appear to get closer together to help give the illusion that you're looking at a three-dimensional scene when it's only two dimensions. So his Donatello's Feast of Herod, you can see that he's leaving his orthogonals visible, these lines on the tiles of the floor here. I'll draw a couple of them for you. He's leaving these tile lines visible so that you can imagine these orthogonals retreating and then meeting at some point up here. Where the lines all meet, that's called the vanishing point. So yes, he would have carefully planned out his orthogonals and then not put all of them obviously on there, but you can get an idea. Now he's using orthogonals in the floor tile and also in the ceiling architecture. You can see a couple of orthogonals present here. There's one there, there's one here. You can imagine it continuing. And so again, all of these lines are retreating towards a vanishing point on the horizon line. The horizon line is where everything disappears. Linear perspective is a mathematical way of calculating just how small things get as they retreat into space. It's very accurate, it's very scientific, and so it's going to be very Renaissance. They're going to really like this. Donatello is one of the first ones to use it. I should say, whenever I mention a Ninja Turtle, you should definitely be writing things down because they're going to be really important. It's just kind of a trick to learn when you're learning about Renaissance art. The Ninja Turtles are very famous because they picked famous Renaissance artists to name their Ninja Turtles after. Donatello was one of them. We don't need to talk about what's happening in the scene, but we can discuss how impressive it is that on this relatively flat two-dimensional surface, right? I mean, it's a relief carving, but it's pretty shallow. You get to the sense of a really deep recession of space. We can see at least 3 rooms. One back here, and another one back here. So we can see at least 3 rooms going back into space. So that's very impressive use of depth. Much more impressive than in other scenes where we would have, this wall be completely blocked off because they're not interested in creating this window into space. Well, now we're talking about the Renaissance, so now we definitely are. It's possible that Lorenzo Ghiberti would have been aware of Donatello and what Donatello was doing with linear perspective, because when Ghiberti finally did go and finish his East doors for the Baptistry of Florence, he uses linear perspective, and he leaves his orthogonals also visible. I'm not going to draw because I don't want to draw through the scene, but you can follow the lines as they retreat into space, into the horizon line. So these are his orthogonals. You can follow on the floor, and you can also see them going back this way in the in the ceiling architecture. Architecture and floor tiles are a really good way to leave your orthogonals visible. And early on especially, they wanted to make sure that you could see their orthogonals so that you would be sure to see that they were using linear perspective, because it was such a new technique that they wanted you to be able to see their sort of, even though we might look at it and be like, oh, what, he's like showing his training wheels, kind of orthogonals, like leaving the grid open is kind of like showing your training wheels. But they were kind of proud of it because at the time no one else was really using linear perspective. It was really a new thing. These are his East doors. It's the Jacob and Esau panel, so it's another Old Testament scene. We don't really have time to discuss everything that's going on, but you can see 3 different sort of parts of the story happening over here. Here's Esau getting the blessing that he stole from his brother. Again, we don't really have time to get into the whole Bible story. The main gist of these doors is that they're using a lot of really accurate linear perspective, and the bodies here, we don't see any more of this S-curve. In fact, especially in this one right here, we can see some bent knee action, which is going to be a prefiguration of finally getting to some contrapposto. The proportions are also getting closer to the idealized head is 1/7 of the body proportions. Michelangelo called these doors the Gates of Paradise, which, if you know Michelangelo, and when we get to Michelangelo in chapter 21, you're going to learn about Michelangelo. He didn't like anything that he didn't make. Michelangelo's favorite artist was Michelangelo. And so if he says that he likes something done by someone else, you know that they were really significant and important. So if he liked these doors, if he called them the Gates of Paradise, then they must have been really special. And we can see very accurate use of clear linear perspective, naturalistic recession of space, a clear scene that looks like a window into space. That's what we're looking for, realism and the Renaissance. Again, the whole scene just looks rational. We talked about the rationalization of sight in chapter 18, so I'm not going to cover it again. But again, they want to see scenes that look believable now. It's starting to work its way into art. They don't want the supernatural effect from the Italo-Byzantine style, which is really important. In Florence, there's a building called Or San Michele. So we're in Florence now, no longer in Siena, Florence the city. Or San Michele, it's not a church, not only a church, it's a sort of a city hall type building that the guilds in Florence, hopefully you remember guilds, if not review them real quick, that the guilds in Florence used for their meetings. I'm not exactly sure how often they would meet, but they would have, meetings with all the members of the guilds, and they would rent out this space, basically. It's called Or San Michele. So it's a big open hall where the guilds would hang out and have some snacks and talk about things like setting prices and whatnot. The guild masters in Or San Michele wanted to decorate the exterior in the early 1400s because all of Florence is really going through this redecoration as part of the Renaissance. They have a lot of money coming in, and they can sort of tell that they're the center for this, new trend that's starting, this new humanism, and they want to reflect it in their buildings. So they hold they want to sort of organize a redecoration of the exterior of Or San Michele, and each of the guilds that used this space were assigned one of these sculptural niches, or niches, I don't know, however you want to pronounce it, and each one had the job of commissioning a sculpture for in the interior of it. So we're going to look at our first one. I actually think it's this one right here. We're going to look at a detail of this sculptural niche or niche, whatever you want to pronounce it. It was commissioned of Nanni di Banco. So Nanni di Banco was hired and given the commission of this sculptural niche. And his commission was the Four Crowned Martyrs. Again, even though we are talking about secular guilds here, everyone is Christian still. And so Christianity is the sort of common theme behind everything. Nanni di Banco was commissioned by, in this case, the Sculptural Guild. So they obviously going to want to make sure that they have a really good sculpture because this is their forte. So Nanni di Banco is commissioned to portray these four men. They're the Four Crowned Martyrs. They're called the Four Crowned Martyrs. They're the patron saints of the Sculptural Guild because back in the 4th century CE, so way back in the day, right before the time of Constantine, they were executed by the Roman government because they were forced sculptors who refused to make statues of pagan gods because they wanted to be Christian. And so they were executed for their beliefs. We call that martyrdom, and they became saints. And because they were sculptors themselves, they became the patron saints of the Sculptors Guild. So these are the Four Crowned Martyrs. We don't actually know what they looked like. No one knows what they looked like, but the Nanni di Banco gives them all individual facial characteristics and even gives them all individual, you can see that the start of an interest in maybe some psychology. They all kind of have their own personalities. Similar to other aspects or other Renaissance works that we've studied, Nanni di Banco has these Four Crowned Martyrs engaged in conversation with each other. They're not staring out at us as the viewer. In fact, they're not even really acknowledging that we're there. It's almost as if we are having a little sneak peek into their private conversation. The individuality behind each of these figures with their specific, individual facial features and personalities might have come from the ancient Roman practice of verism. In Roman art, they liked to do portraits that accurately reflected or caught or captured what the person really looked like in real life. Romans were really into that. So verism comes from the word for truth. The practice of verism, so the veristic style of sculpture, is capturing a true likeness of the individual. So all of these statues of Romans looking the way that they did in real life, remember, are all over the Roman Empire. And Florence, at one point, the city of Florence, or the area of Florence, was under the control of the Romans. So there were these Roman statues all over the place in the Roman Empire that featured veristic portraits. So they would have actually had access to them and seen them and understood that this is what Roman artists were interested in and Roman patrons were interested in, and there's this idea of individuality. Individuality, or having people that look a specific way or capture the way that they looked in real life, is another is another humanism characteristic, another aspect of humanism that was popular, because everyone's individual nature was important. As a sort of self-made man or as a unique person. They were also sort of getting, starting to be interested in what makes us unique. They're going to start to study that in the next century, so try to get a deep study of psychology. But why are some people different than others? Why do they behave differently? Why do they react differently in the same situation? Okay. So these are the four crowned martyrs. And down here below them is a sculptor's workshop. So they're working on this. This is a statue. So again, remember, this is created by and for the Sculptors Guild, so that makes sense. Another niche on Orsan Michel was done by, once again, Donatello. Looks like he's interested in bronze sculpting as well as marble. Well, stonework in this case. So, again, these Renaissance men like Donatello are going to have a hand in a lot of different artistic mediums. So this is Donatello's Saint Mark. So for the same building, done for the Guild of the Linen Drapers. So this is the Linen Drapers Guild, and they chose to depict Saint Mark, and they hired Donatello for the sculpture. Even though the other niche was done by the Sculptors Guild, Donatello's Saint Mark actually gets credit as being our first true Renaissance sculpture. And it's because he's bringing back one very important aspect of classical sculpture that we really haven't seen fully thought out. Hopefully you're starting to think about this idea of contrapposto. We discussed it way back in chapter 18. Contrapposto is the way of standing naturalistically or casually with all of your weight balanced on one foot and your other knee relaxed and bent. Because your one leg is straight, your hip juts out to that side, and your shoulder, the opposite shoulder, tends to compensate by coming forward a little bit, and then your face looks over that shoulder. Oh, hey, that's exactly what Donatello is doing here with his Saint Mark. If Saint Mark didn't have these bulky robes on him, which kind of makes sense because they're the linen drapers, is for their guild, but also because it's a religious figure, they're not going to show Saint Mark naked. But if we can imagine Saint Mark naked, which is a fun thing to say, you would imagine him looking very much like that Doryphoros, like that classical sculpture, that statue that we studied at the beginning of chapter 18. The nude standing in contrapposto. So that's what we can see here. And that's why Donatello gets credit as being the first sculpture, being the first Renaissance sculpture or statue. Again, we can see, similar to Giotto's Madonna and Child Enthroned, that we have the laws of nature, of proportions, the way that the drapery is reacting, of the laws of gravity and that kind of thing, and individuality. Here, these laws of the human world being applied to a divine figure. This very Renaissance. Not everyone is going to jump on board of this Renaissance bandwagon. I just wanted to show Gentile da Fabriano's adoration of the Magi, because it was made in Florence during the Quattrocento, but it is certainly not something that we would call Renaissance in style, even though it's from definitely the Renaissance period. It seems that even though the Renaissance was becoming popular among many of the secular patrons, it was not popular among all of the patrons. Similar to when a new style comes out today, and some people are going to embrace it, whereas other people, sometimes older or old-fashioned people, appreciate more this sort of older style. And so I don't have it up here yet, but take a second and try to think about what you might characterize this as. We see people wearing non-historic outfits, right? This is not something that the Magi would have been wearing, but this is something that people would have been wearing in 15th century Florence. Decked out, with lots and lots of jewelry and gems, decoration not only on their outfits and the jewelry that they're holding and wearing, but also their halos. You can see the detail of Mary's halo is decked out in fake gems. And then, yeah, you see things getting smaller in space, but you're definitely not seeing any use of linear perspective. This is something we would call more of an aerial perspective. And you see people standing in more of an S curve position rather than contrapposto. So see his leg is bent, or his leg is straight here, not bent. So, overall, yeah, we would call this international style, maybe even international Gothic style. But if you watched our last chapter, you know that I'm not fully, I don't fully embrace the difference really between the two. I think it's just a difference in time periods. Just an illustration of sort of a holding on of the international style between centuries, because some people are still interested in doing things the old way or doing things similar to the way that they're doing them in the North. Remember, the North is still international Gothic style at this point, even though now we're in Italy. This is just a reminder of another example of the international style. Cut to Masaccio's tribute money. I've also seen it called tribune money. I don't really care which one you call it. I guess you're all going to call it tribute money because that's the way I have it written out here. This is from the Brancacci Chapel in Florence, and it was paid for by a secular family to decorate to decorate their sort of private chapel that was part of this cathedral in Florence, or part of this church in Florence. And they commissioned a man named Tommaso Guidi, better known as Masaccio. He takes the name Masaccio. He decorates the entire chapel in fresco painting. I don't have a picture of the whole chapel. I only have this detail. This is a detail. It's a large part of the fresco, showing a scene in which Christ and his 12 followers, his 12 apostles, want to enter this city. They're asked before they enter the city by this Roman in his short tunic, because that's what Romans wore, little tunics. They're asked by him to pay a fine or a tax before entering it, but Jesus and his followers were not in the habit of carrying around cash with them wherever they went. And so they're looking around like, this is kind of awkward, we don't have any money. So Jesus goes to his good friend Peter. This is Peter. You can always tell Peter because he looks cranky and he has a beard. That's always Peter. And he goes to Peter and he says, "Hey, go to that river over there and pull out a fish." "Okay, Christ, whatever you say." Here's Peter. He goes over. He can see he's taken off his orange robe, and he pulls a fish out of the ocean, or out of the river nearby. And inside the mouth of the fish is exactly the amount of money that they need to get into the city. It's a miracle. That's Christianity for you. So he takes the money and he gives it once again to the same Roman who was asking them for cash in the first place, and then they're able to enter into the city gates. So that's the story that we're looking at. Now we have to talk about what makes this and Masaccio and this work the first real Renaissance, early Renaissance painting that we've covered. I mean, we covered Giotto's early Renaissance work, so I mean, obviously very important and very significant. But Masaccio now, almost 100 years later, is the one to give us our actual early Renaissance painting during the early Renaissance period. We talked about Giotto having many characteristics of the early Renaissance, but being very, very ahead of his time. Okay, so what's going on here? Well, first off, you should note, you should already be noting, the informality of the scene. The figures, once again, are not engaged with just staring out at the viewer, but they are locked in their own conversations and talking to one another and engaging within their own scene. They're not posed for us and staring straight out at us, but they're locked in their story, participating in the story. In fact, you could say this is an attempt at recreating what that story actually looked like when it really happened. Masaccio goes, similar to Giotto, he goes the extra distance of trying to show people wearing their ancient costumes. So Christ and his followers are not wearing what people in Florence would have worn in 1427. In fact, they're wearing togas, which is much more accurate because that's what they would have been wearing in, the first century CE. They're not staring out at us, but they're engaged in their own conversation. Masaccio is also one of the first ones to loosen up these halos. Up until now, we've seen halos sitting flat behind people's heads like dinner plates. But Masaccio is one of the first to have the halo move and rotate with the head of the person. So depending on which way you're facing, your halo will go a different direction. And that's, he just believed that made it look a little bit more naturalistic. If you ever see halos like this that come loose from the background that don't just sit straight, you can take a pretty good guess that you're looking at something from the 15th century, from the Quattrocento, and that it's post-Masaccio, because he's one of the first to do it. So, just to recap, right here we have these halos. They don't move with the head. Here we have halos that don't move with the head, right? They just stay flat behind the person. Whereas in Masaccio's, they look almost like little visors or hats that stay balanced on their holy figures, on their saints. Accurate costume, people engaged in the scene, halos that are more naturalistic, looking more like hats that rotate with the head of the individual. Oh, speaking of the individual, everyone has their own facial characteristics in this scene. They have their own facial features and even attempted showing their own personality. Remember I told you St. Peter's always a little cranky. Some people are looking at each other with astonishment. Some people are looking a little embarrassed because they don't have the fee. Again, interest in individual personality and what makes us different and unique in our psychology. Over here in the corner, you can see that Masaccio is using other elements that he's borrowing from Donatello and sculpture, incorporating some linear perspective, right? Let's follow this orthogonal back towards right here where we can imagine our vanishing point on the horizon line. Here's another one, right? And you can see that it's getting closer together towards the background. Really, that's why he included this building, was so that he could show and illustrate his use of linear perspective. Masaccio is also using, in tribute money, aerial perspective, also known as atmospheric perspective, which we haven't covered yet. At least we haven't covered it in our slideshow. You were supposed to come across it in your readings. Aerial or atmospheric perspective is the idea that things get hazy or less clear and visible as they get further away. You have human eyes. We don't have perfect hawk-like vision. And so if we're looking at mountains in the background as they retreat and recede into space, we're going to start to see less and less detail the further away those mountains become. And that's what atmospheric perspective is trying to capture. So by the rules of atmospheric perspective, if we're looking at this mountain, which is very far off in the distance, we're not going to be able to see individual trees or birds or animals on this mountain. It's going to look hazy, it's going to look sort of grayish, and it's all going to blend into one color. These closer mountains, we might be able to see some green areas for trees, and so that's, we can kind of make it out. But as we get further away, we see less detail, because that's how human eyes work. It's not necessarily how painting has always worked. The idea in painting, it's hard. You look and you're trying to imagine these scenes. You're not painting them from life. And so the impulse as an artist might be to paint a couple trees on this mountain in the background. But that's technically not correct because our human eyes would not be able to see those trees. So that's atmospheric perspective. Everything gets hazy and blurry as it gets further away. Oh, sorry, if you're curious, this was painted for the Santa Maria del Carmine in Florence, and it's, again, for a private chapel within a public church. And the scene that we're covering, if you're curious, is from the book of Matthew. It's a Roman tax collector trying to charge them, but they don't have any cash. The arrangement of the figures, where you have the main figure of Christ here in the center, actually being the first part of the story, and then the second part of the story over here, and then the third part of the story on the other side. It's called a composite narrative. We're used to having narrative scenes run from right to left because that's how we read. You imagine, for example, a graphic novel or a comic strip, but here we have a composite narrative, meaning that it's not in order. It's not moving from right to left. It's moving from center to the outside to the other side. And we're relying on the repetition of figures to help us figure out what's happening in the scene. So in this case, it's St. Peter. We see St. Peter 3 times so that we know that there are 3 scenes because there's not 3 Peters. It's another aspect of, or characteristic you could say, of the Italian Renaissance, is using this composite narrative and not framing things out, going, this is one scene, this is the next scene, this is the next scene, but having us sort of rely on our knowledge of the story as well. It's a little bit more naturalistic. The last characteristic, Renaissance characteristic, that I want to talk about with Masaccio's Tribune Money is his use of, or his mastery, I should say, of the arrangement of light and shadow. For this example, I want you to look very closely here at Peter's robe because it's the most well-preserved area of this technique, this arrangement of light and shadow. Don't look at Christ's robe here. This is not a good example. It was touched. Too many people touched it, and so it got dirty, and then it got over cleaned, and so that's why it looks kind of washed out. Other areas of the fresco are likewise not in great shape, but this area of Peter's robe is an excellent example of Masaccio's technique of arranging light and shadow, creating a sculptural illusion of 3-dimensionality on a 2-dimensional surface called chiaroscuro. We talked about the arrangement of light and shadow on Giotto di Bondone Lamentation. We looked, for example, at this figure in the front, where the light is hitting her on the shoulder, and then there is an absence of light or darkness down here between where the fabric is draped, another one right here. So things start to look a little bit more 3D because Giotto is one of the first to have one source of light and then shadow arranged in between those spaces. It's starting to become more rational. However, if you look at his arrangement here, at his color choices, you can see that this light area here, he mixes white into it. This dark area, it just looks like a more deeply saturated green, deep saturation. And there's a difference between color saturation and darkness. So look here right now at this figure, and then look back at Peter's robe. Where Masaccio shows darkness in this orange, he doesn't use a more saturated color orange, but he adds black and gray and brown to his color scheme to make it look like it's actually in darkness to better capture this shadow. This is the difference. This is chiaroscuro. Chiaroscuro is creating this sculptural 3-dimensionality by using believable black and gray in the shading areas, and then areas of light in the areas where they're being struck by light. So that's chiaroscuro. And Masaccio is one of the first artists to use it in this tribute money from the Bracanci Chapel in Florence. Hopefully I gave you guys a lot to think about for that first significance question that we have, talking about Masaccio and the characteristics of Renaissance painting. Oh, you can also see some of the Giornata here. This split is an example because we are working in buon fresco. He's working in buon fresco at this point, meaning painting on wet plaster. In a different area of the Bracanci Chapel, Masaccio has a scene showing the expulsion of Adam and Eve from Eden. So this is Adam and Eve getting kicked out of Eden. It's an Old Testament scene where Adam and Eve, we've covered it before, but Adam and Eve eat the forbidden fruits, and God finds out about it, and God gets mad at them, and so he kicks them out and he punishes them. We've talked about their punishment before too. Adam is going to get punished by having to work the land and farm it instead of just eating fruit that falls from the trees. And Eve's punishment is painful childbirth. So that's what we see. They're in the process of getting kicked out of Eden. Here's the gate behind them, and they're walking out. They're covering themselves in their shame, and they're wailing at the mistake that they made. And they're very, very upset. I particularly feel for Eve here, who's very upset about, after having a child. I feel really for Eve's sort of pained expression. But Adam and Eve, despite the sadness of this scene and the emotion that they're showing, Adam and Eve, Renaissance artists loved Adam and Eve because it was their excuse to depict the nude in a church setting for a church commission. Remember, I talked about how the nude is really, really important and significant for the Renaissance, being able to capture the human figure because the human figure is so important, and capture the proportions and capture the realistic qualities and characteristics of the human figure. And this is their excuse to, and their, this is their ability to show their mastery of the nude for these commissions. So you see the same sort of representations that we saw in his tribute money. Chiaroscuro, light and shadow, not in great shape. You can see the giornata here very clearly, not in excellent shape anymore. But I just wanted to we'll mention the attention to some of the anatomy in Adam. You can see some of his ribs here as well as his abs and this hip action right here, very, very naturalistic and realistic. Chiaroscuro, as the light hits him in the front, and then the back of his leg is in shadow, showing even some of the anatomy down here of his feet. Kind of, pretty realistic. I really, though, want to talk about his figure of Eve, because first off, let's look at a comparison from a very, very much earlier slide. This is from a medieval bronze door panel. This is God pointing at Adam and Eve. He's mad at them because they ate the fruit, the forbidden fruit. He's blaming Adam, who's directing the blame at Eve, who's directing the blame down here at this serpent/dragon thing that is going to get punished. Just look at their bodies, right? Their bodies are so cartoonish and not naturalistic that it makes a really good point of comparison between the medieval period and the Renaissance period. For the Renaissance, they're not going to look at scenes like this from the medieval time period. Instead, they're going to look at the classical antiquity, these sculptures and statues from the ancients that are surrounding them and that are all over the place in Italy. One of those examples is this, which is a copy of this. A statue of Venus called the Capitoline Venus that is modeled after Praxiteles. Praxiteles, similar to Polykleidos, a really significant, a highly significant classical artist. So he's from the High Classical period, and this is his depiction of Venus. Venus, if you're not familiar, is also the name for Aphrodite, same person. Romans called her Venus, Greeks called her Aphrodite. The scene that he's capturing here is a scene in which Venus was disrobing, about to get into the bath, when she realizes that someone's creeping on her. So she goes to cover herself up really quickly. So she's trying to be a little bit demure, but it's still very sort of sexy because it's one of the first Greek statues of a naked lady. There were not very many before this. So she shows all of the idealized proportions for a woman. Standing in classical contrapposto, covering herself up because she's aware that someone's looking at her. I should say that the original of this statue, this is not the original, this is a Roman copy that was made. We don't have the original, unfortunately. But the original of this statue stood in the Greek Agora in Athens, and it was, people thought it was so beautiful that men would hump it. We know that men would hump it because they have laws forbidding people from humping this statue. And so, when you have a law forbidding something, that people were doing it because they had to create a law to stop people from doing it, because they said that the ejaculation was bad for the bronze. The statue was originally in bronze. So anyway, that's just a fun story. This was their archetype of beauty, basically, this Venus statue. And so just look at the way her hands are, and then look at our Eve right here in the same hand position. Hers is more of a shame gesture and not so much a just trying to cover herself up quickly because she noticed someone is looking at her. But it's definitely a direct quote of antiquity, and he's doing it on purpose. So this is a copy of an ancient master of sculpture, in this case in a two-dimensional form. Masaccio's next big commission was of a fresco of the Holy Trinity from Santa Maria Novella, which is another church in Florence. And here he's painting the Holy Trinity. If you're not familiar, the Holy Trinity is the Father, which is God, back here in his big beard, the Son, who's Jesus Christ, and the Holy Spirit, who's this dove. We've seen him before impregnating Mary. So that's the Holy Trinity, Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, also sometimes called the Holy Ghost. His painting of the Holy Trinity for the Santa Maria Novella was a little bit more public. Remember that the Brancacci Chapel, yes, it was in a public church, but it was a sort of a private chapel, a sort of private room area, whereas this would have been very, very public. We're talking about the Holy Trinity here because it's a really, really accurate use of the linear perspective system. Masaccio really perfects this system from a technical standpoint in fresco. Well, you can see already that next to the actual wall fresco, I have I know it's reversed, I'm sorry about that, but I have a image showing his lines that retreat into the horizon line right here. These are his orthogonals coming from the top. You can follow them in the decoration on the barrel vault that's going over the scene, and you also have orthogonals coming in from the bottom. So everything is retreating into this horizon line onto this vanishing point on the horizon line. This horizon line, I should say, when you stand in front of this, is approximately eye level. So it really creates this illusion that you're looking into a believable space. It's a little bit higher than eye level for me because I'm kind of on the short side, but generally it's about at the eye level. Below the scene of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, you have the two patrons, one on this side, one on the other side, and then below them you have a completely pictorial stone slab with a skeleton. Some people think that this is three-dimensional. It's not. It's completely painted. It's just painted with such accurate orthogonals that it looks 3D, even though it's actually 2D. This is a skeleton, I should say, laid out on a stone slab, and then written above it, it says in Italian, in Latin, it says, "I was once what you are, and what I am you will become." It's called a memento mori, which is the reminder of death. Just, in Christianity, it was important that you remembered that the life that you're spending is temporary. The tomb here projects. He's creating a projecting tomb that comes forward towards the viewer, whereas the room back here retreats into space. And he does this by arranging his light very carefully. You can see that this column here is well lit, and it has a shadow on the space behind it, so it creates this illusion that it's coming forward, whereas this area, the orthogonals retreat backwards. Really very genius. In fact, he had such a successful application of perspective that other people, not me, were able to go back and mathematically recreate the scene behind him. So they can use his orthogonals to mathematically determine how tall this illusionistic barrel vaulted room would have been and how deep it would have been. They can basically mathematically recreate the room that is completely fabricated using linear perspective. So here's the depth of the room. Here's this is Mary and the saint on either side. I think it's John. I forget which saint it is. I'm sorry, guys. I think it's John on the other side. Yeah, Saint John. Then Christ, then the Holy Spirit, then God the Father. Outside of this sacred archway are the two patrons. So you can see that they are placed in front of it, so they're not technically in the room. And then projecting even further forwards, you see the illusionistic skeleton on his stone slab. Isn't that crazy? You can actually calculate the dimensions of these imagined spaces. It's pretty committed of him to mathematical, and it shows you just how useful linear perspective is in creating a naturalistic, realistic space and scene, which is what the Renaissance is all about.